Welcome to Courageous Conversations with Heman, where we unpack the most pressing human rights challenges through bold questions, lived experiences, and global perspectives. I'm your host, Heman, a researcher, activist, and someone who believes that legal identity is more than just a document. It's a difference between being seen and being invisible. Today's episode is not just a conversation, it is a journey through borders, caste lines in a legal systems that decide who belongs and who does not. Before we get into this, let me ask you something. What would your life look like without ID? No bank account, no school, no job, no vote, no future. In South Asia, for many Dalits, religious minorities, and women, this is not hypothetical. It's their daily reality. This issue of statelessness of people who exist but are not recognized is not just local, it's global. Which brings me to our guest, Dr. Bronwen Manby. She is one of the world's leading voices on the legal identity and statelessness. She has worked with the African Union, Open Society Foundations, and countless global organizations to address what it means to be excluded from citizenship. She's also author of Citizenship Law in Africa, and her work has shaped the global policies from UNHCR to national governments. Dr. Manby, it's an absolute honor to have you here. Welcome to Courageous Conversation. Let's go back to the beginning, not just your CV, but your conviction. You have worked across Africa for decades, but was there a moment, maybe during your time at Open Society Foundations, when you realized that statelessness is not just a legal issue, but one of the survivals, especially for the women and the poor?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So my interest and engagement and knowledge about statelessness and legal identity started really around about 2005 or so. Before that, I'd been a human rights lawyer, worked for Human Rights Watch, I worked for Lawyers for Human Rights in South Africa, which is where I live in the UK, but my parents came from South Africa, which is how I come to be interested in Africa in general, working outwards from South Africa. I was working for the Open Society Foundations at that time, and the Open Society Justice Initiative, which was a sister part, a different department of the organisation, was doing some comparative research about discrimination in general, but specifically in relation to access to identity documents and nationality in Africa. And they'd commissioned research from national consultants in a dozen different countries. And then, as is usually the case, these reports come in and they are all in different condition and they don't quite match up. So I started off really just doing an editing job. And gradually I thought, I can't do this comparison unless one wants to know what's going on in all the countries. And in particular, how do the former British territories differ from the former French territories? If you're going to understand how these procedures work, you cannot escape the colonial heritage. And so what is the difference that colonial heritage has made? And of course, the French and British are the major players in Africa, but Portuguese, German, Belgian as well. And so I started looking for all the nationality laws of African countries. At that time, internet was much less developed. Only around half the laws were available online, so I was trying to collect all the other laws, and then backwards to independence. How have these laws changed over time? How does the change in the law of nationality, the law of who belongs, reflect colonial heritage, reflect the trauma of colonization, reflect ongoing migration patterns? How does the law relate to the politics of belonging? And I just found this thread completely fascinating, because as a lawyer, it's really interesting just to see how the complicated questions of different laws interacting with each other work. And then as a student of politics, it's just, what is more political than who belongs? What is more fundamental to a society? And who is one of us and who is one of them? But very soon after you have done this comparative law, looking at the Citizenship Act, you then realize, no, you have to look at the birth registration system. You have to look at the passport law. You have to look at the voter registration law. You have to look at a national identity document law, if there is one. Because when it comes down to it, the law can say you're a citizen, but if you can't get the document to prove it, it's irrelevant. And always one sees that the people who are subject to discrimination in every other aspect of life also face discrimination in this area. But what is interesting about the statelessness and legal identity lens for looking at it is there are some obvious legal reforms and tools that you can propose beyond everybody should just get along. Everybody should be nicer to each other. You can say, no, there are some very specific changes that you can make here that don't require everybody to be nice to each other, but nonetheless give people access to some rights and services. Of course, they are never sufficient, because in the end, people will carry on not being nice to each other. But at least they can provide some basic established rights in relation to the state. That was a very long answer to your question, but I hope it answers it.
No, thank you for, providing us with the insights. And it really reminds me one thing that I often see in South Asia in comparison, how caste and religion quietly detect who gets an ID and who does not. It is informal but brutally effective. Talking about your work on nationality laws, how have you seen social hierarchies like ethnicity in Africa replicate what caste does in South Asia? I understand that you do not have expertise in caste in South Asia, but given the comparison, how do you see any similar patterns of exclusion here?
Yeah, of course, I'm familiar in general with how the caste system operates, and in particular, I know some of the discussions around, for example, around exclusion based on that area, and also more generally about statelessness in South Asia. So the situation of the Urdu-speaking people in Bangladesh, situation of the Assamese who are alleged to come from Bangladesh, the situation of the Bengali-speaking people in Pakistan, and so on. So I'm familiar in general, but I don't claim any particular expertise there. But what I think is very striking is that the categories of people who face statelessness, and by statelessness I'm meaning they are not recognized as a citizen in any country in the world, are really quite similar across countries. There are some obvious, on the face of the law, you could see that the person is not a citizen. So the classic example might be a Yemeni domestic worker, female domestic worker in Saudi Arabia, is raped by her employer, becomes pregnant, gives birth to a child. Under Saudi law, a child born out of wedlock does not acquire the citizenship of the father. Under Yemeni law, a child born abroad of a Yemeni mother does not acquire citizenship. Stateless child cannot get documents anywhere. And then there are the situations which, and some of the categories I just mentioned in relation to South Asia are also present across Africa. So the decolonization process and people who moved within what was a common area of free movement during the colonial era are now in, quote unquote, the wrong country when the states separate. And the new rulers of an independent country say, no, we're not having these people, we only want those people. You came, the fact that you were brought as forced labor or came, completely legally is irrelevant. You're not the category of people that we want based on ethnicity, based on religion, based on caste potentially as well. So, for example, in the European context, we see when Yugoslavia split up, that's not exactly decolonization, but what we call in law succession of states. So one state takes over sovereignty from a previous state. So Yugoslavia split up. The minority in Yugoslavia that nobody wants to have are the Roma. They face systematic discrimination, somewhat in the same way that Dalits face in India. Maybe not as extreme, but despised, seen as unclean, criminals, etc. So Serbia said, oh, no, they're from Croatia. Croatia said, no, they're from Montenegro. Montenegro said, no, they're from Kosovo. And so many thousands of Roma were left stateless in that process, even though they had been citizens of the former Yugoslavia and should, in theory, definitely have belonged to one of the subsequent countries. But that moment of establishing a new country said, we don't want those people. And so you see, something there of the politics of the situation of Muslims in India, although there are so many Muslims in India that it's not possible to do quite the same thing, but nonetheless, you see that type of discrimination. It's more difficult to Muslims in India as well, but also remaining Hindu population in Pakistan, for example, to facing those types of challenges, and of course Dalits too, and people who have converted to Islam, but nonetheless, everybody knows that what their origins are because of name, because of family histories, and so forth. And you see that type of pattern is the same all over the world. And then, of course, there are more recent migrants, refugees, people who've come as workers. they traveled in an era when identity documents were much less common, and now it's like, well, you're here, you're here illegally, but I was born here. My parents came here, my grandparents came here. How can I be illegally present in a country where I was born, and so on and so forth. So that kind of question of the lack of any accommodation for historical and more contemporary migration patterns as well.
Really makes sense. You were involved in shaping a global guidelines for strategic legislation and nationality laws. And when drafting the strategic legislation guidelines, did you ever worry about that global frameworks might overlook the complexity of the gender and community exclusion operation in different regions? How do we can ensure that these global norms do not flatten local justice?
So just to clarify a little, the guide on strategic litigation is not a global normative framework. It's aimed to be assistance to lawyers. And so it's based on my experience and a lot of research looking at how have lawyers at national level litigated these questions of access to citizenship and the identity documents that go with citizenship in different countries around the world. Probably more examples come from Africa because I'm more familiar with the African context, but there are plenty of examples from Asia as well about exactly that question. How do you litigate? Looking at the apex courts, they're not so much lower level because there are too many cases, but looking at what of apex courts, the Supreme Court of India, for example, what have they said about these issues? And also what have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the UN treaty bodies, so the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Human Rights Committee, and so forth, that oversee the different human rights treaties at both regional level and at UN level. One of the challenges in the Asian context is that there isn't a regional human rights court or commission or so forth. There are some very weak discussions, but there is no such process. So the idea of it's a report really rather than a normative statement, but the idea is to provide resources to lawyers who are seeking to litigate the right to citizenship, the right to nationality, and I'm using citizenship and nationality to mean the same thing as they do in international law, to say, look, especially, for example, talking about South Asia, they're all Commonwealth countries, some degree of common legal heritage there. But look, there's this interesting case from Nigeria. You could actually use it here. Or South Africa Constitutional Court has got some excellent jurisprudence in particular. Lots of cases referenced. You can use these arguments before the Indian Supreme Court, before the Pakistan Supreme Court. Now, cases, judgments from another country are not legally binding, but they provide ideas for how you can litigate something, how you could present an argument to the court that says this is not legally outlandish. Other courts have ruled that you have to follow these rules, and you're not doing anything out of the ordinary. It's just these are rights that should be respected and that exist in different legal frameworks around the world and indeed in the global frameworks. So the normative framework in Africa is well developed, but there are opportunities to try and develop the same types of statements at the national level in other regions as well.
In your global forum contribution, where you emphasize the decentralization of nationality laws, especially naturalization, can you help us imagine this? What would decentralization, naturalization look like, perhaps for a rural woman in Africa or the South Asia who's been rejected by the state for years, or realistically navigate the bureaucracy to gain a citizenship?
So there are two separate discussions here. One is naturalization, and by the term naturalization, we mean a person who was not born a citizen, who comes to a country, lives there for 10 years, let's say, and then has the right to apply based on that residence to say, I wish to become an Indian citizen, I wish to become a Pakistani citizen, and then the conditions will be residence, you'll usually have to show good character, you'll usually have to show legal residence, you might have to prove a minimum income. Different countries have very different rules around this. Typically, these processes are highly centralized in the Ministry of Home Affairs or the Ministry of the Interior, and so you have to make an application in the capital city or to a website owned by the Ministry of the Interior, and that's a highly centralized process and very discretionary. Separately, there is the question of how do you get an identity document. You say, I am a citizen and I want an identity document. Those processes are typically quite decentralized. You have to go to your local, the administrative office in your region or in your town or whatever, and the local police station. I mean, they can be really very decentralized. Is that in different countries, in different contexts, the in many African countries where, on average across Africa, birth registration is less than 50%. Now, of course, that varies hugely. A country like Congo has 5%. A country like South Africa is up at kind of 90%. So, but nonetheless, on average, less than 50% or around 50% of birth registration. So in this context, if somebody needs an identity document, you are obviously going to have to use other forms of proof and evidence. So this is for a person who in principle says, I am Nigerian. I need an ID document. So then, what are the procedures there? And the argument I was making in that forum for Global CIT, which is a global comparative citizenship law initiative, was that in the African context, where levels of documentation are very low, in practice, how people get assimilated into the national community is through these quite low-level procedures. They're not actually applying for naturalization in the capital city. They're getting a birth certificate, they're changing their last names, and, of course, there's always the allegation, well, that's fraud. People are cheating their way into this, but people are not doing this for bad purposes. They're doing it because they believe themselves to be citizens. In any logical legal framework, they would be citizens, but the processes to become citizens are not accessible to them. Now, whether this works in the favor of the applicant or against the applicant depends a lot on local context. So in some countries, ethnicity and caste statuses exist in Africa as well. So, for example, leather workers have a low status everywhere. It's not quite as extreme as the situation in South Asia, but it's, that blacksmiths, leather workers, many societies have that type of discrimination. Slave castes as well. Across the Sahel, slavery pre-existed colonization. Now, the type of slavery was very different from plantation slavery in what was the New World at that time, but those distinctions exist. If those have, some countries, they've faded away. So Senegal, for example, they're there, but they've faded away. But in a country like Mauritania, much stronger, that kind of discrimination. So in a country like Senegal, and also Senegal has a relatively open nationality law, somebody will say, we know your father was the headmaster of the local primary school, of course, that's fine. But in other cases, they say, oh, no, your last name is what? I'm really not sure about that last name. I'm going to have to go and do checks. And then, and then you never get a reply. You never get a reply because somebody's always checking. No, come back 2 weeks time, come back 6 months time, come back. And you never ever get that reply. So you never get refused, but you never get accepted either. So that's where that kind of, the argument that I was making in that post was that given that this is the reality of how these administrative systems operate, what one really needs is proper regulation of those systems. So that if you don't get a reply after 6 months, after another 6 months, there's then a process to sort out and if somebody says, well, we're not sure you're Indian, we think you're Pakistani, then, a court has to investigate, or somebody with proper legal qualifications and the ability to resolve the situation, say, okay, so maybe India and Pakistan are not talking to each other, so we can't have a cross-border conversation here. But nonetheless, looking at it, it's not plausible that we can send you back, quote unquote, to India or back to Pakistan, So therefore, let us just go through, have a procedure to make sure that can happen. So my point was that in some countries where there's less politicization, this is what happens, and it's possible. In other countries, discrimination and administrative discretion operate negatively. So what you need are some rules about evidence, about due process, and some basic protections against statelessness. If it is not plausible that you are ever going to be able to send this person to their quote-unquote own country, because their own country isn't their own country is where they're living, then there needs to be a process to grant them the documents and what the legal identity and citizenship where they are, because that's where they are contributing to society, that is where their lives are. And there's no other country to which they could be plausibly said to belong.
Dr. Manby, when we talk about the legal identity, we also talk a lot about the Sustainable Development Goal, which is 16.9, which addresses the legal identities for all. But we often, see the most marginalized, especially like Dalits or indigenous groups, are invisible in implementation. Talking about your work in Africa, I would like to ask how legal ID programs are reaching the poorest. Or are we just creating a new class for technically excluded citizens?
Yes, that's the target is to provide legal identity for all, including birth registration, by 2030. Everybody knew, so these were adopted in 2015, everybody knew what birth registration means. There's a very decades-long history of UN guidance about birth registration, about how to design a birth registration system. And the target went beyond birth registration because it's obviously also the case that a birth certificate does some things, but it doesn't unlock other things. So therefore, you need to go to a broader idea of what legal identity might be. But this varies hugely across different countries, and nobody put a definition in that target. So legal identity doesn't have a definition, and therefore everybody's inventing it, or not so much inventing it, but interpreting it to mean what they want it to mean. And one of the challenges here is that amongst the people interpreting it to mean what they want it to mean are the biometric technology companies who say, I don't know, we can solve your legal identity problems if only you buy our equipment and our software. And what the promise is that this new technology, especially biometrics, fingerprints, but of course iris recognition, facial recognition, will solve all the problems about who is who and who belongs where. But of course, it's a very famous saying that there are no technological solutions to structural problems. And if you have very strong patterns of structural discrimination, new technological solutions are likely to reinforce those patterns of discrimination unless very clear steps are taken to avoid that. In some countries, some steps have been taken to address those patterns. In others, the technology has been welcomed as a new way of enabling surveillance without providing rights. And that is the challenge. But so I think, insofar as the legal identity target refers to birth registration, there have been some strong initiatives to improve birth registration, some really good progress made in some countries to do that. But the challenge again with birth registration is that even if you have 95% birth registration, which is a distant dream for most African countries, it's still who are the 5%. And the 5% are going to be the people you expect them to be. The abandoned babies being brought up by somebody else, the street children, the Dalits, the people facing discrimination, the people living in border zones, and it's never quite clear, the border goes through their village and both sides say, no, you belong to the other one, etc., etc. So it's the people belonging to the wrong religion, the wrong ethnicity. Those are going to be the 5%. And if you don't have a way of addressing their situation, which requires legal and policy reform, and not just administrative procedures, then they are going to remain excluded. In the end, you need reforms to the law, you need reforms to policy, and not just even old technology. Paper is not will not solve the issues, but certainly your fingerprints do not tell you where you are a citizen of. They allow you to say, I'm the same person that I was last week when I'm accessing my bank account. That's definitely true, but they don't resolve the underlying questions about the contested status of people belonging to groups that nobody wants to own.
Dr. Manby, as we are fast forwarding to artificial intelligence, what role do you see of AI in citizenship or identity programs? Do you see that it is going to marginalize them at the bottom, or will these programs will provide the benefit to these invisible people?
My fear is that they make everything worse. It's of course one can see that there are some possibilities that AI could be used to identify people at risk and to resolve their situation. I fear it's more likely that AI is used to identify people we think are foreigners and therefore to target them for deportation. One sees apparently that happening in the United States right now, whereas huge data sets which were kept carefully separate by previous rules on data protection have been put together by Elon Musk and donors in order to identify people who might be in the country illegally and have them deported. Now, most of those people are not stateless, but some of them are, and they are being deported to countries where they have no connection, including South Sudan, Eswatini, different places, Ecuador. The deportations are, that's being enabled by AI. Of course, you could use it for good, but technology, as another famous saying is, technology is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. It can be used for bad purposes, and the more powerful the technology is, the more dangerous it might be.
Yeah, while preparing for this podcast, I come across something really interesting, and I reflect a lot on that. Something like that. Not all stateless people are undocumented, and not all undocumented people are stateless. Can you please clarify the distinction, and why is legal terminology so crucial here, and how can we shape the better policies for that?
So looking at the question about not all stateless people are undocumented, the most obvious example would perhaps for South Asia be the Rohingya. So they are denied citizenship. They used to be citizens of Myanmar, and they have been denied citizenship in Myanmar for some decades now. the citizenship law in Myanmar specifically discriminates on the basis of ethnicity, and the Rohingya are regarded as not being the right ethnicity. So they are not, they are stateless. They're not, and Bangladesh equally, where most of them are, does not recognise them as citizens. At the same time, they're definitely not undocumented. Many of them have refugee documents or the equivalent, and Bangladesh is not a party to the Refugee Convention, but they have documents issued by UNHCR. They have documents from Myanmar. They have different, Myanmar went through a series of different identity documents. Many of them have historical identity documents. They even have more recent identity documents. They're repeatedly being identified, but they never have the document that says citizen. And that's true of a lot of different stateless populations. Now, in some contexts, identification as stateless is one, so the Myanmar are registered as various different statuses. Sometimes recognition specifically as stateless, so you are a documented person and it says stateless. Sometimes that can be useful because if the legal framework in the country where you are says that if you are a stateless person, you can naturalize, then you may hold that status for, let's say, 5 years, and then you can acquire citizenship of the country where you are resident, and you have resolved your situation. But sometimes, more commonly, you've got a status that says non-citizen or refugee or member of cross-border ethnic group or something that means that you're not exactly illegally in the country, but you're also not fully a citizen. Now, equally, so that's many stateless people can have documents of that variety of different types depending on the national context. But equally, undocumented people may not be stateless. If you think until very recently, like the last decade or so, a very large number of people anyway were undocumented, including birth registration rates were low. There was no national identity card. If you wanted to open a bank account, you didn't need to prove your citizenship. You just needed to show that you had a proof of address, perhaps, and a letter from your employer. The bank doesn't care if you're a citizen or not. The bank cares if you've got money. And so if you've got an employment, that's good enough for them. And they know they've got an address, so they know where to come if you don't pay your loan or whatever. So that's enough. But increasingly, banks and landlords and hospitals and schools are almost being turned into branches of the immigration service. So that immigration enforcement is being being delegated to these other groups and say, well, you can't put your child at school unless you're a citizen. You can't get treatment for your illness unless you're a citizen. And this is happening everywhere. So I don't know if you are, or your listeners are familiar with something that in the UK is known as the Windrush scandal, which is people who came as children entirely legally to the United Kingdom in the 50s and 60s, largely from the Caribbean. They were not born in the UK, so at that time being born in the UK would have meant that they were automatically British, but they came as 2-year-olds, for example. They grew up in Britain, they believed themselves to be British, their parents had come completely legally, there was nothing illegal about anything. When the countries in the Caribbean became independent in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they still were legally resident in Britain, but at a certain point they didn't fill in an administrative procedure to say, the parents didn't on their behalf. So as Britain has become more xenophobic and the immigration enforcement is being decentralized in that way, this cohort of people are reaching 60, 70 years of age. They're getting to be sick, turning up looking for cancer treatment, looking for treatment for heart disease and so forth. And the hospital are saying, prove your citizenship, and they can't. Or prove that so they have been paying taxes all the time. And suddenly, and then in other cases, they've committed, in some cases people have committed a crime, and then they say, well, we're going to deport you to Jamaica. I've never been to Jamaica since I was 2 years old. So that's what's happening. Whereas, they had been living in Britain without proof of citizenship for many, many years, and there was no issue. But as that's been true, so undocumentedness or lacking proof of citizenship does not necessarily mean you are stateless. But as the requirement to prove who you are is becoming more and more pervasive, people who are undocumented are finding that some of them sort themselves out, then there's no problem. But the people who cannot sort themselves out become visible by omission, by that everybody else gets their documents managed because they're a member of a majority ethnic group, because their parents were formerly married, because they're relatively well off and so forth. Whereas the people at the margins find that they cannot resolve that. So the ones who are undocumented, but there's nothing problematic about their family history in the eyes of the administration, can sort themselves out. But the ones who belong to minority groups, such as Dalits, find that they can't.
Last but not least, Dr. Manby, for our global audience, especially those working in the law, policy, or activism like me, What's one principle or insight you wish more people understand about statelessness and the fight for legal identity? Something that cuts across continents, systems, and histories.
I think having a citizenship, having a nationality is one of those things. It's like breathing oxygen. Until you don't have any, you really don't think about it. And that question of suddenly you need to prove something, and you find, oh, but I can't. I had no idea. I didn't. People, that kind of context in which you've been informally adopted. Your parents died, you were informally adopted into a family, but you were never formally adopted, and suddenly you turn 18 and you need an ID card and you can't get it, and you spend years trying to sort that out. You're a member of the wrong type of ethnic group. Your birth was not registered. That kind of knowledge, that how important it is to get those questions sorted out. If you're an activist, the younger the person is, ideally a baby, you get it sorted out as soon as you can, because as soon as a person becomes prominent in some way, or possibly gets in trouble with the law. I mean, I see many cases in the UK where people came as children, they're children of refugees, they get into trouble in the law in some minor way, dealing in marijuana or whatever, get involved in a fight, get sent to prison for a couple of months, and once they've been in prison, has to be more than 1 year, and then gradually things escalate, and suddenly it's like, we're going to deport you to Somalia. It's like, how does one resolve that situation? So getting those issues resolved, the importance of the legal and policy frameworks and thinking about them before they become a problem is so critical to resolving these issues. And when it comes down to it, every child's birth must be registered, but that is not sufficient. In the end, you have to say, a person born in the country, whose parent was born in the country, whose grandparent was born in the country, how are you ever going to tell them to go home somewhere else? They are home, and that must be recognised, that the legal framework must be put in place to recognise the reality of people's connection, rather than constantly saying, no, you don't really belong here.
Dr. Manby, this has really been eye-opening conversation, not just intellectually, but morally. You have shown us that legal identity is not just a bureaucratic process, but it's a moral commitment. And your work reminds us that while laws may draw borders, but activism redraws them. Thank you very much for being here with us today. You rightfully said that you can born in a country, speak its language, live by its law, and still be told you do not belong. That's why we like conversations like this, to challenge and to change that. Thank you very much for being part of this insightful conversation, Dr. Manley.
Thank you. It's always interesting to talk about these discussions.